Hi, Michaela.
Hi, Steve.
Well, Valentine's Day is approaching. Actually, we're recording this in late January, and so Valentine's Day really is approaching. And we were talking before we began recording that in your experience as a relationship counselor and workshop teacher, this approach of Valentine's Day often causes couples to reevaluate their relationship and try to increase the romance, perhaps doing something special for each other, that sort of thing. Traditional, isn't it, when Valentine's Day comes along? And of course, also that means many people who advise on such matters are putting out lots of articles and videos and TV specials and things like that. So it's in the air, Valentine's Day. In fact, you have an event in Ojai in America, Valentine's Day weekend. So I wondered if we might explore a little bit from your point of view, the point of view of the work that you do, these themes of how to improve one's relationship, how to bring more excitement, how to increase intimacy, for example, and connection, these sorts of things.
hmm Yeah, I did an interview the other day for an article that comes out for Valentine's Day, and it was kind of a Q&A that they asked me to answer a question, and the question was, it's February. I feel, not very sexy in my body. It's icy cold. My skin is dry, but I think I need to do something for Valentine's Day. And I in the interview, I was talking about the fact that, of course, for most people, February is definitely the month where they feel the least sexy. And so from a biological viewpoint, also, it's not really the moment where the juices rise, so to speak, like when spring comes. But here we are. And it's, of course, a very artificial holiday, yet I think that any holiday or any occasion that makes people want to connect and have more pleasure and have a better relationship is a good holiday. So I think when I was looking at all the different things that are out there now, and like you said, I'm also teaching a relationship boot camp that weekend. I thought it would be good if we kind of look at the different ingredients that go into making a relationship good or preparing you for your next relationship. Because of course, not everybody is, in a relationship, and also not everybody wants to be in a relationship or in a conventional relationship. So I figured I'll kind of just pull some of the things apart that are out there and discussed and offered, because I think when it comes to relationship, it's really important that you know what it is that you want to fix or that what you want to learn, right? Because there's lots happening there. You can go to, some tantric sex camp, or you can learn how to have better communication, or all kinds of things. People do, all kinds of plant medicines, whatever. There's many approaches out there these days as to how you can improve your relationship. And so I think the important piece is that when we talk about relationship, that's kind of a blanket statement for everything, meaning it's two people being together for the sake of, let's say, romance, the erotic, perhaps children, a life, right? So if we kind of look at relationship as the connection between people, traditionally two, but nowadays, of course, that has also changed. Then we can look at relationship as kind of the overarching thing. But for most people, relationship isn't just the connection with a human; it's also sex, and it also has a spiritual dimension. And very often, these things are, let's say, influenced by imprints that we're not aware of. And so when people then go and they want to do a relationship workshop or a sex workshop, then it's, I think, important to understand that there is distinctions. So I figured I'll just run through the distinctions the way we use them in in the way we work with people or in our offerings, and then maybe we'll see, where we'll take it from there. So, one of the big things that I always talk about is that there's a difference between a relationship problem and an erotic friction problem. And I can't say that enough because there's so much conflation there. And so the relationship is essentially built on sameness, meaning common ground, agreement, collaboration. And when you want to improve your relationship or the relational aspect of your relationship, then what you're looking at is improving communication, which is very important. When you can't communicate, you won't be able to agree on things. And relationship is really predicated on agreement, on being close together, on being on the same side of whatever you are trying to achieve. So when we look at a relationship, your number one skill to acquire is communication. Being on the same page and the language and skill to agree on things, right? And that's one of the main skills. So if you need to improve your relationship, the ability to get along, then communication is your first port of call, so to speak. Similarly, when you want to improve the relationship aspect of your life, you want to learn how to connect, and connection, of course, has a few aspects to it, one of which is, of course, can you actually stay focused long enough on your partner without, let's say, a phone or reading something on the computer or something? That's one big skill that you can learn, is how do you keep your attentional focus on your partner? And then also, how can you connect in a way that feels meaningful, through touch, through, the way you sit, the way maybe you walk together, the way your bodies kind of synchronize. So there's a lot of skill that can be learned if you want to learn how to connect. And then, of course, another aspect of building a better relational understanding is having a joint purpose. And that's something, of course, we talk about a lot, like the purpose of a relationship, and really establishing, and then every couple of years reestablishing the purpose of a relationship, so that when you agree and when you communicate and when you connect, you know where you're going, and everything within the relationship is put in the service of that purpose. And so those are relational skills. And within those relational skills, you'll then also establish things like how do you deal with logistics? How do you not kill any kind of positive regard and connection by constantly talking about admin? How do you how are you a parent and still have some time for your partner, and things like that? So that all falls into the umbrella of relationship and the skills you can learn. Now, when we then talk about the, let's say, intimacy, erotic friction aspect of things, which most people want more and better sex and some version of that. It doesn't always have to be sex per se, but that kind of flirtatious, exciting, playful spark that most people really enjoyed when they first started their relationship, and which tends to go, because the more of the sameness you have, the less of that explosive, magical spark you have. So if you're missing the spark, and missing the spark is something that you'd like to acquire some skills around, then you would focus on learning how to establish erotic friction. And there you can really acquire some skills, and the skills are all centered around creating difference, so creating opposite ends of the spectrum in what you do with a partner. So meaning One person decides on the date, the other one goes along. One person brings the enjoyment and the energy, the other person knows where it's going. So those kind of very classic opposites attract kind of skills that you can relearn. And the way you do that is typically you figure out where you have actual talents and gifts that you can offer your partner that are not your partner's talents and gifts. And so that's a very important aspect to really focus on, is what can you actually give your partner that makes your partner excited and feels new and adventurous. And skills there range everything. It's a wide range, everything from acquiring ideas and thoughts of something you can do with your partner that's new, which is quite difficult for most people. And most people don't actually know what to do that's new. Newness, of course, is one of the big spark builders, which is why when people go to hotels or vacations, they tend to have a better time erotically. So how do you create newness, and where are the skills and ideas coming from, which is one thing that I do in the relationship bootcamp, because people don't know. So we do this whole afternoon-long fact-finding expedition, so to speak, on what are the things you can offer a partner. Then, of course, there's also skills around the actual, let's say, erotic or sexual, which you can always acquire, or you can always acquire more sexual skills if that's something that you want to bring to the partnership. And then you can really up your game when it comes to seduction and play, because there is usually where most people have very limited bandwidths. They have their home flavor, as I call it, meaning who they typically are. And while that's delightful to your partner, perhaps after a little while, it feels like the same meal every evening. And that's when a lot of the trouble starts, with people not really feeling like it, because it's same old, even though you like your partner. So there's a whole realm of acquiring skills around what I call flavors. That's why, I have the flavor cards, and it's a lot in the workshops. There's a lot of work around how do you, like almost like a coat or a costume, put on a slightly different flavor that mixes things up. And this is true for anyone in the relationship. This goes both ways. So developing skills around seduction and play and different flavors and different offerings is one of the quickest and funnest way to amp up the erotic play. So that's the, let's say, erotic friction department. But then, and this is a bit harder to acquire. So, there's lots of things you can do for relationship. There's lots of things you can do for erotic friction. But then there's a whole other consideration when it comes to a well-functioning relationship. And that is, have you dealt with and have you explored and, made some kind of inroads into your, let's say, unconscious drivers, your imprints that come often from multiple, directions. So when I talk about imprints, it's the things that we acquired sometimes at a very, very young age, where there's generational imprints around relationship, also trauma imprints, of course, familial imprints. There's the imprints of your parents, because, of course, when you were raised by your parents, you see them interact and you see their relationship, and that becomes an imprint. There's, of course, society and religion that can form an imprint, and previous partners also form imprints. So that's an awful lot of baggage, so to speak, that most people have only unpacked if they have to deal with some specific set of circumstances, or there's some trauma attached. But for most of us, those unconscious aspects of how we pick partners or how we behave or what we believe of what we believe about ourselves really influences a lot of the relationship style and the relationship drivers. So being able to unpack that is very useful. Not very sexy, definitely not the thing that most people want to do for Valentine's Day. But I wanted to mention it because there's a lot of really, really good work that you can do when you understand what you've come in with. And there's a whole world that opens when you see how your parental influence or your societal influence is making you choose how you're in relationship. So I think that's a very worthwhile aspect of exploration to go into those imprints. So when we look at these imprints and when we look at how we can go into those dimensions, that's where a lot of the Jungian work comes in, right? Shadow work, archetypal work, myth, story, but also where somatic work comes in. So you can do a lot of excavation and also release with modalities like nonlinear movement, with practices that are in their nature essentially shamanic practices. So movement, ritual, rhythm, things that allow the nervous system to unwind and kind of sort and sift through these imprints and patterns. There's a lot that can be done with somatic work and also kind of mythic and archetype work. And then, of course, there's a whole other dimension that often gets a little bit wrapped up with, the sexual dimension, which is kind of the dimension of the heart or a spiritual dimension, right? People talk about sacred sex and all of those kind of things. But I think it's important to kind of delineate that as a separate thing, which is the willingness to open your heart, the willingness to be of service, so to give of yourself, the devotion to something greater than yourself that includes a partner, of course, and in general, the willingness to open and receive as well as give. And that's also something you can practice. It's essentially a muscle, and devotion and service and opening of your heart needs to be practiced very much like any other skill, because we tend to habitually close or preserve ourselves, reserve it for a few people, if ever. So there's a whole lot of practice that can be done. So those are some of the things that I wanted to kind of mention as what's possible and how you can slice your deep dive into relationship.
Yes, very interesting indeed. A couple of follow-up questions. First, you mentioned novelty as being one of the key ideas to bear in mind when trying to revivify the intimacy track, as you've laid it out there, these 4 tracks. Sometimes novelty, this idea of doing something new, it sounds fantastic. If you've had 8 hours of sleep and, you're well caffeinated and you've got a couple of days ahead of you, etc., etc. But I think very often novelty, despite its revivifying effects, can also be met with a sense of resistance. Why is it that sometimes novelty, which can be so good for us when deployed strategically, can sometimes elicit feelings of resistance or even reaction of fatigue or aversion? And how to overcome that?
I don't know what to say about that.
Well, perhaps I'll say something then. I mean, I know what I had in mind.
You're going to say something?
Well, I think it's more energy efficient, isn't it, to do the same old, same old. That's part of what the same old gives you. It's the power of routine and it's the power of repetition, is that it becomes less cognitively expensive to carry out those sorts of tasks that you can, in a way, habituate, make a routine of, etc. So sometimes there can be, especially if one's stressed and there's a lot going on, you've got a lot of demands on your time and energy, there can be a resistance to want to jump the tracks of routine, try something new. Maybe there's a desire for it on some level, but when it comes down to it, to actually doing it, there can be a resistance because it's cognitively, energetically, if you want, relatively more expensive than just sticking to the familiar.
Yeah.
But in the same way that going to the gym is physically demanding, and sometimes we feel resistance towards that because the body is saying, save your energy, you've got a lot going on. But it's ultimately good for you and ultimately replenishes and strengthens your energy. Similarly, engaging in strategic novelty can be revivifying to the very faculty that it initially appears to be expensive in. In other words, it gives you more energy, it gives you more cognitive flexibility, vivacity, the contact of with joie de vivre and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives, in other words, precisely where it appears to be taking, if it's deployed strategically. That's what came to mind. I wonder if you agree with that idea or if you have any other thoughts.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And that is one of the reasons why we tend to stick with same old, not only in the, let's say, erotic domain or relational domain. And it's certainly true in a lot of relationships. You hear this, every Sunday morning, you go to the same brunch place with your same friends and order the same breakfast, right? And that's, while it's very comforting and it might be good from a relational viewpoint of there being a ritual, so to speak, from a erotic friction viewpoint, that's a very bad idea, right? Very bad idea, because you're on autopilot and it's very comforting, but it's not very sexy. So absolutely, this is a big aspect of creating something new. Go to a different place, or at least drive there, a different road, or do it on a Saturday instead of a Sunday, whatever it takes to create a different kind of activity. And this is, of course, also true with sexual things or with the way we engage erotically. And that's where the flavors come in, right? Where you can put a slightly different expression into the relationship that just has a bit of a different outcome.
So there's nothing wrong with routine, and there's nothing wrong with the same old, same old. It's just that if it's seasoned with occasional variation of some type, even as simple as trying a different restaurant, if that's your thing, then in a way it doesn't fall into the trap of making things very flat.
Yeah. There's other reasons why we don't like new things, of course, and that has to do with potential failure. Essentially, the things we always do have to, at least some extent, worked, or we think they work. And when you try something new, particularly when it comes now to the more relational, erotic aspect, are you going to embarrass yourself? Is it going to fall flat? Are you going to be rejected? Right? These are actual things that people are worried about. And so I think when couples decide that they want to, change things up or spice things up, then there has to be an agreement that it's essentially an adventure you go on together. And you're kind of exploring different things. And when something goes wrong, then it's just like, oops, oh, well, that didn't work. Let's try something else. And not, you're always getting this wrong, right? Which is, of course, what often happens. But that's one of the reasons why people often are very resistant to new experiences or trying new things, because it comes with a fairly high price as well.
Another question that we often get that on this podcast that comes to my mind at this moment is this idea of what if one of the partners, perhaps the one listening to this podcast, takes these strategies on board and wants to apply them in some way, or comes to the workshop or takes some sort of a course, one of our online courses, and wants to implement those strategies in some way or another, but the other partner doesn't. Maybe even this, we do hear this, not all the time, not even most of the time, but occasionally, that sometimes the other partner will feel it's a threat. Almost the implication is that things aren't good enough. I'm not happy. Why would you want to change things? Why would you want to do things differently or explore a different way? And sometimes perhaps that partner has a point. Maybe there is a kind of perennial dissatisfaction being expressed there, but not always. So what would you say about that? If you're a partner who's listening to this and thinking this is great, how to introduce it into your relationship with a partner who's interested in the relationship maybe, but not so much interested in quote unquote working on it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first and top rule here is you don't tell your partner that that's what's going to happen now, because that essentially is the implication that there's something wrong. And when you come at it from there's something wrong and it needs to be fixed, no one ever feels good about that, right? And so that's the golden rule: is you don't go, well, this isn't working, this is wrong, I'm bored, we always have the same sex on the same day, and we need to fix this. Anytime you start fixing things, you're essentially saying that how it is now isn't good. And while that might be the case, you have to give your partner at least the option to save face, so to speak, and get on board with potential changes. And a way to do that is to essentially just introduce new things, or take the lead in trying something different and maybe not even mentioning it, if that can be done. Or if you mention it, then from the desire of just trying something new versus fixing something. Usually goes a long way if you just point towards exploration and adventure and away from essentially triage and problem solving. I also think it's important to say, this is not very romantic, but it is important to say that some things can't be fixed and some things can't be changed, right? So even if you're going, okay, well, I'm not going to say I want to fix my partner, but really I don't like how it is, and this is a constant complaint, and I've tried everything. Well, sometimes things can't be fixed, or people are not compatible, and that's a real thing. And not all relationships survive the discontent of the incompatibility, right? Certain things you can certainly change, and you can certainly learn some skills. You can certainly improve communication and all of that, but not everyone is compatible or is willing to work on the things that actually do need to be addressed.
Yes, very interesting indeed. So we do have a special segment coming up, a special question I'm going to ask you. But before we get to that, I wonder if you might say something about the events we've got coming up and some of the offerings we have in person and online in general, and also related to the theme of today.
Well, I'm in California for the relationship bootcamp. That's on the Valentine's Day weekend. And that particular bootcamp is essentially, it's not just for couples. You can come by yourself or you can come with a partner. You don't have to have a partner. It's the skills we're talking about. It's skills around how do you actually communicate your needs, but also what are your needs. There's a whole section about giving and receiving. And then there's a whole section around newness and adventure and fantasies and things like that. So it's a very full weekend of skills that you can take home and really infuse into your relationship. So that's in California. And then we have two Portugal retreats that are both geared towards these general themes. The one in April is called The Untamed Heart, Devotion and Freedom. And that one essentially works with all the underpinnings, all the imprints, the relational imprints, the epigenetic imprints. It looks at how do you actually open your heart? How do you give and receive through your heart? There's all kinds of new processes in there that gives people a chance to reshape those imprints and then choose how to step into any relationship with different flavors and different archetypes. And then in October, also in Portugal, there we're really looking into myth and story and archetype and how that shapes us as a human and how we then bring ourselves to not only intimate relationship, but to our life as a full and kind of integrated, powerful human. We'll do a lot of somatic work and a lot of, let's say, archetypal and shadow work, so that each person gets to kind of, let's say, fluff out their offering and who they are, and leave the workshop with some new experiences and skills.
Very good. And we've also got, of course, online courses like the relationship course and other courses like that, which are instant access. You can get access to the whole thing right away. And that's an option also on the website, michaelaboehm.com. Okay, so to our final segment. And, one of the things we're going to do in this podcast for this last segment is we'll talk about all kinds of things. Last time we talked about what we're reading over the Christmas period, and we'll talk about books and things like that sometimes. And all kinds of weird and wonderful questions I'm going to be throwing at you in this last segment. But this time, and this might be something of a recurring theme in these podcasts, is role models. People you admire, or are inspired by, or think are laudable in some kind of a way. So I'm curious, this episode, Michaela, who is your role model?
Well, I've just come out of a bit of a winter break, and so there's a few things I always watch when I have time. And one of the things that I've seen, I don't know how many times, is a documentary about the Tsoknyi nuns, which are Tibetan nuns. I think we can link to it right in the description. I think it's called Blessings, the documentary. And it's essentially a documentary about nuns who have, for many, many years, sometimes hidden, and then later a little bit more open, had this area where they practice. And so there's a nunnery, there's education, but there's also retreat huts. It's a story of these women who are Buddhist practitioners who are going with their teacher, who is the root lama of these nuns. And so they're going to Tibet, they're traveling there, and they get to visit the nunnery, and they get to speak with some of the women practitioners, and they get to practice with the women. And it's an incredibly touching documentary. And the reason why I thought about it when you asked about role models is that there's a very specific theme that I watch it for, and that is this group of women who've just come out of, or they're at the end of a 3-year retreat. And they're in this hut, and they've been in this hut for 3 years, somewhere in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And of course, in the course of these 3 years, the hair has grown really long. And the women get to visit them, and it's being filmed. And then it was released once they were out of the retreat. And it's this group of women who've been in this tiny little place together. It's like packed in there. And they're so ecstatic and so beatific and so open, and permeable and joyous. And it's incredible. Every time I watch it, it makes me kind of cry. I want to cry in this very deeply touched way. And so when we talk about role models, I don't think we get to see that a lot, right? Not a lot of people in general, and not a lot of women in general, get to spend that much time in dedicated practice. where there's nothing else required of them other than practice and devotion and study and communion and collaboration. And it's just such a beautiful documentary because there's such a dedication to practice and a dedication to what I talked about earlier, right? The dimension of the heart, that spiritual openness to beauty and to love and to God, and however you want to say that. So I always look at these women in this retreat hut as role models, as far as the kind of openness and radiance and joy and ease that's there, and it's very simple, and there's no airs to it, right? They're giggling and they're laughing, but their faces are just so incredibly joyous and ecstatic. So that's what I'm going to pick as role models for this podcast, and I think it's very um, it's very evocative to feel it with your body, to see people that open and happy and joyous.
Those are the Tsoknyi nuns who have sites in Nangchen, East Tibet, and across Nepal under the directorship of Tsoknyi Rinpoche. I remember we've watched that documentary now several times together, I think, and it's interesting, isn't it, what we find inspiring. In this case, does the inspiration inspire you to do something with the inspiration? For example, to meditate or something like that. Do you yearn to go on some sort of closed retreat in the mountains, for example? Or is there some other kind of inspiration, the inspiration of seeing people engaging in contemplative practice per se, or dedicating their lives towards the good kind of, if you want, religious piety? There's something uplifting about that, I think, just generically, even if you yourself don't necessarily want to join them in that. What sort of impact, if I was to ask you that, does that inspiration have on you?
Yeah, I'd say on the surface, the first thing is that, yes, of course, I always yearn for more time to practice and have some time to really devote to contemplation and devotion. Right, that's always the first thing when I see somebody spending that much organized time in that context. I have a yearning for that, for sure. But I also think, aside from that inspiration to put more time away, or aside, I should say, not away, time aside for contemplation and for practice, there's just also this, it's almost like the joy in in the practice of others. It's like, and this is always true. You showed me once this beautiful documentary about the monks on Mount Athos in Greece. And while that's not exactly my bend, so to speak, spiritually speaking, that had a very similar effect on me. This kind of very relaxed, open devotion to contemplation and practice and prayer and a certain kind of a life. It just does something when you see people enter that or really devote themselves to it. I find it hugely inspiring. It's true for many, many things, not only just monks and nuns, but when people really, really take themselves very deeply into something that they're devoted to. Jane Goodall is a very good example of that, for instance, right? Who devoted her entire life to something. That's just really inspiring to me.
What would you say is your highest value that contextualizes all the various work you do? You teach workshops, you have clients and so on, but you also rescue animals and you renovate houses and help people in all kinds of ways that are not professional in the sense of being monetarily compensated.
Mm.
What is the thing that you see them striving towards? What's your version of that?
Well, I think it is a version of devotion, right? Like an offering of my gifts and talents in the service of not only other people's well-being, but beauty, joy, um, well-being. So it's something around that. I don't know exactly what the word would be, but the service of my my talent or my gifts or my competence into something that creates an opening. That's how I would probably phrase it.
Well, Michaela, this has been very fascinating indeed. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you, Steve.